November 1965, the first full-scale battle of the Vietnam War.
We ran into the jungle firing our rifles.
The whole world exploded.
The first helicopter assault. The Drang Valley is the first time American draftees faced the Army of North Vietnam.
It's the worst day of my life. I can't even think about that day.
234 young men die in a place no one has ever heard of.
There were so many dead and so many wounded. It was awful.
Everybody, move out! Get out!
I'm Jack Smith, and these are stories of the Vietnam War, told by the people who know it best, those who fought it. Tonight, we'll experience the first major battle of the Vietnam War. It was one of the bloodiest, and certainly one of the most chaotic. The Battle of the Drang Valley in November of 1965 included pitched bayonet battles at close range, napalm strikes, and the first full-scale helicopter assault of the war. Desperate American commanders even called in artillery strikes on themselves in a last-ditch effort to stop the marauding enemy. The Drang was also my own piece of the Vietnam War. I was a private in a rifle company in the 7th Cavalry, and it was an experience that would change my life. First, some quick history. In 1965, there are some 23,000 American troops on the ground in South Vietnam to beat back the communists and prop up the South Vietnamese government, but it isn't working. When regimental-sized units of the regular North Vietnamese Army are spotted in the South, President Lyndon Johnson orders a massive troop buildup and doubles the size of the military draft.
I have today ordered to Vietnam the Air Mobile Division.
It sent a shockwave through the entire 1st Cav Division.
Hal Moore is an up-and-coming infantry lieutenant colonel at Fort Benning, Georgia. He'd fought in Korea, then is instrumental in developing the Army's new doctrine of air mobility that will deliver soldiers quickly into battle by helicopter. He is eager to show the world how to fight a war by helicopter from a network of base camps against an unconventional enemy like the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong guerrillas.
It was like constructing a fort in the western United States in the late 1800s against the Indians. Then you go out from the fort and you'd fight the Indians.
Vietnam is moving from the north down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, infiltrating the central highlands of South Vietnam, and wants to cut the country in half. On the 12th of November, the U.S. Army decides to go out to the enemy sanctuaries in the central highlands and bring the war to the North Vietnamese. The 7th Cavalry, Air Mobile, gets the call. Hal Moore has only 400 men of his own. The great equalizer is to be the helicopter, specifically the Bell UH-1, for utility helicopter, known forever as Huey. Instead of slogging along at a snail's pace, following trails and paths, the cavalry clips the treetops at 110 miles an hour for same-day delivery into the landing zone.
We went low level. The formation's very tight, and we get right down in the treetops.
Bruce Crandall will go on to fly lead ship in 756 missions in 2 tours in Vietnam.
We would once in a while hit the tree with our skids to keep the infantry awake also.
Landing Zone X-Ray is a football field-sized clearing at the base of a large hill called Chupong Mountain. The hill is reported to contain a base camp for the North Vietnamese and provide them with plenty of cover. But the area also presents Hal Moore with his best chance to get a lot of men on the ground in a hurry.
We ran into the jungle firing our rifles, and we made no contact. And I was very happy about that because I had a whole battalion to get into that area, and I only had 16 helicopters. And it would take me 4 hours to bring in my battalion.
John Herron's Bravo Company in the 1st Battalion, 7th Cav is on the ground first. His men quickly capture a prisoner who seems to be either a straggler or a scout from a North Vietnamese unit.
And I left the platoon and moved up because I wanted to hear what that prisoner had to say myself. And of course the interpreter was translating all this, but basically what he said was the Chupong is full of North Vietnamese regulars, and they want to kill Americans.
Almost immediately, 1,400 North Vietnamese regular army troops from the 33rd and 66th regiments pour off Chupong Mountain from the north, west, and south. Only 150 Americans must hold off 3 battalions of the enemy. But Air Mobile, which has worked well in dress rehearsals back in Georgia and North Carolina, is a different story under live enemy fire. For Bruce Crandall, it will never get worse than at X-ray.
6 people of my helicopter got hit from in the landing zone. A person raised up within about 20, 30 yards of the aircraft and shot 6 people off my bird. Akuchi shot the people in my aircraft that were dead, so violently dead. The radio operator had taken a bullet in the head. It was a wall of steel, literally. Come in.
At the command post in LZ X-ray, Hal Moore works his radio. The news coming in from the field is not good.
These enemy were tough. They were strong, they were well trained, they had good weapons, new uniforms, good haircuts. And they were determined to overrun and kill us all.
And the North Vietnamese have the Americans surrounded.
But I had one thing that this enemy did not have. I had firepower.
Bomber jocks saddle up in Da Nang, Tan Son Nhut Air Base in Saigon, dozens of small strips that make for LZ X-ray.
Like I said, I pulled a chain on everything I could lay my hands on. Fighter bomber aircraft, artillery, aerial rocket artillery. This enemy did not have any of that stuff. And I brought it in as close around us as I could possibly.
It is essential Hal Moore keep the enemy far enough away and isolated so he can use artillery and air power on them without killing his own men. But the North Vietnamese want to turn X-ray into a hand-to-hand brawl. They call this grabbing the enemy by the belt. At 2:45 in the afternoon, wounded stream into the medical station at the command post. With the temperature over 100, water and ammunition start to run short in the field. It's 3:30 before the last of Moore's men make it into X-ray. They have to pass by dead bodies and wounded Americans trying to get out. Then, with things looking as though they couldn't possibly get any worse, disaster strikes. A young platoon lieutenant, Henry Herrick, has his 28 men give chase to a few North Vietnamese and is now cut off from the main force. Herrick is an ambitious redhead who wants to win the Medal of Honor. Lieutenant Dennis Deal is one of the men who must try to save Herrick's lost platoon.
Henry Herrick had fallen for a 4th grade sucker play by the North Vietnamese. They had hung a couple of people, I guess, out in a clearing, and he took off after them.
And then the next call was, I'm under heavy attack. And I think they have gotten between me and the 1st platoon.
Lieutenant Herrick was killed within the first 10 minutes. Platoon Sergeant Carl Palmer took over. He was killed within the next 5 or so minutes. A forward observer artillery forward observer attempted to take over, and he was shot through the head. And a three-star buck sergeant, squad leader, Sergeant Ernie Savage, took command of the platoon.
Ernie Savage, a career soldier from Alabama, immediately begins to call in artillery fire around his position.
I think they did finally decide basically where we were at, and I started adjusting firing, got it right in around us.
The lost platoon is literally out in right field, alone, surrounded, and outnumbered. Artillery cover is nothing more than a stay of execution. 2 attempts to reach the lost platoon are repulsed with heavy casualties. Support troops at landing zone Falcon, 5 miles away, start an artillery barrage that will last 5 hours and keep landing zone X-ray open. The lost platoon has 21 dead or wounded of its initial 29 members. The survivors withstand 4 assaults by hugging the ground and shooting along the grass line with 200 North Vietnamese who want to kill them.
What was going through my mind was probably kill as many of them as I could at the time.
At the command post, it's decided there's no way to help the lost platoon short of going in with cold steel. At this point, grad Tony Nadal will lead the way.
I got my company together in the creek bed, and most of them, and I gave them a little pep talk about, you know, it's been tough, but we got a platoon out there of our buddies, and we're going to go out there and get them. And I had them all fixed bayonets. And at 5 o'clock, I made a point. I was the first guy over the top, just like World War I, you know, follow me. And we launched this assault.
As the Americans move up to the north, they run straight into an enemy force that has quietly advanced on them and brought its heavy weapons.
The machine gun went like, and for some reason, it skipped me. And then catch the guy on the other side.
We tried and we tried and we tried to get to Henry Herrick's platoon. Nothing we did worked, absolutely nothing. And we were taking casualties the whole time.
By 5 p.m., the Battle of the Drang Valley is half a day old. Young troops who had flown in green as grass that morning are battle-hardened veterans by now. They feel they are starting to get the hang of it. The order comes down to make another try for the lost platoon.
The whole world exploded. I thought that things couldn't get any noisier, that there couldn't be any more lead flying around than there was. And it was just incredible. People were falling all over the place. Men were going 3 steps and dropping. I was terminal. I was gone. I was finished. I was dead.
Then something that's only supposed to happen in the movies.
I happened to look over to my left, I don't know why, and I saw an American run forward, throw a grenade behind this huge anthill, and he went behind the anthill, waited for the grenade to detonate, and he jumped around and shot into that anthill, shot into something, and it saved my life. And it saved the lives of all the men that were left in my platoon, because that machine gun had us.
The man of the moment is a fresh young lieutenant from Pittsburgh, Joe Marm. He's shot through the face, but lives to tell about it and win the Congressional Medal of Honor.
I always felt before that there wasn't a bullet that was meant for me, and then I had kind of the infallibility. I was kind of infallible, but that really shattered that bubble very quickly.
The thing that it did, it ignited the men in that area. They all stood up and charged forward. It really gave spirit to an entire assault line of about 200 American boys.
The lost platoon stays cut off, but the fighting is stalemated. As the main action closes down for the night, officers take turns talking Ernie Savage and the men of his lost platoon into staying alive. The last helicopter of the day brings in Joe Galloway, the UPI reporter, the first newsman on the scene. He gets a grisly welcome.
And out of the darkness comes this voice. I'll take you to the command post, but watch where you step. There's lots of bodies out here, and they're all American.
At 10 p.m., Bruce Crandall shuts down his helicopter at the An-Khe base camp. He's been in the air for 14 hours. He holds little hope for the 1st Battalion of the 7th Cav.
I prayed for them, but I didn't. I thought I'd be going back in the middle of the night. I thought we'd be trying to get out the ones that we could. And God, I didn't want to. I didn't want to go back in there. I got out of the helicopter. I was sick. I'd never been sick before. Couldn't walk. Upchucked onto the aircraft. I can't stand blood.
That night, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore walks the perimeter of Landing Zone X-Ray and contemplates what might become his place in military history.
My battalion was the 1st Battalion of the 7th Cavalry. The 7th Cavalry fought under George Armstrong Custer at the Little Bighorn. And it fleetingly crossed my mind that we may well be in another Little Bighorn situation, and I was determined it would not happen that way.
Throughout the night, the Americans in Landing Zone X-Ray listen to bugles and whistles as the North Vietnamese shift into position on Chu Pong Mountain. It's been a terrible day. The enemy is just getting warmed up. On the second morning at Landing Zone X-Ray in the Drang Valley, American reinforcements are in place. No one knows what to expect.
It was just getting barely daylight, and I was hoping that maybe they'd all disappeared during the night. And they sent out a patrol of our guys to look for infiltrators or something.
Clinton Poley is an Iowa farm boy, a long way from home, and in a world of trouble.
We didn't have to go being on a machine gun, but they were only out there for a few minutes, and one guy come running back and he said, they're coming, they're coming. And somebody over a foxhole away said, who's coming? Who would you think?
20 hours into the Battle of the Drang, Hal Moore's focus is on his lost platoon, but the North Vietnamese have their own ideas.
At 10 minutes till 7 in the morning, just as day was breaking, we were massively attacked.
The North Vietnamese have massed an overwhelming force under the cover of night. With a good view of Hal Moore's troops, they select a weak spot and wait for an opportunity to rip the Americans apart.
First thing in the morning when the sun came up and the enemy attacked. I'm talking right over here to my left, about 40 yards. And there is, to stop them, about 100 Americans in one company. And the brunt of 1,000-man attack falls on 2 of these platoons. Machine gun fire, rockets, all of it, just an absolute storm of fire. And there were people getting hit around me. And then I began to think that this was a serious business.
Overnight, both sides have brought in reinforcements, among them Rick Rescorla. He's already served in the British Army and is considered a soldier's soldier, and he's on edge this morning.
I gave him the order fixed bayonets. I thought I was pretty calm. I gave the order fixed bayonets, and finally my platoon sergeant, Sergeant Thompson, said, "Sir, that's the 5th time you've given that order to fix bayonets."
We were too few. The enemy were too many.
I got away from the foxhole, and that's when I got hit in the chest. And it felt like a cow kicked me, just that little bullet. You can't believe the impact of it. And it twisted me so sideways that I tripped up over my own legs and fell down.
At this point in the Battle of the Drang, the men of the 7th Cavalry are no longer able to defend themselves. Wave after wave of North Vietnamese pour onto LZ X-ray and engage the overwhelmed Americans in furious hand-to-hand combat. As Hal Moore runs out of ideas and hope, he reaches for the one last weapon the American military keeps for its commanders about to be overrun by the enemy. He gives the sign for a final pull of the chain. The time has come for Broken Arrow.
That code word went out all over South Vietnam. And that code word meant that every available fighter bomber aircraft in South Vietnam had to come to the aid of that unit. Massive air support.
Able to overwhelm American forces on the ground, the North Vietnamese have no answer for United States air power. This kind of stopgap measure will soon become standard operating procedure for ground forces in Vietnam following the Drang. But first, there are some drawbacks to work out.
And I looked off to my right, and there were two F-100 Super Sabres coming right at us at a height of probably 60 feet. One was on on my right as I was looking out, and he had already dropped 2 cans of napalm. I couldn't do anything about these 2 cans that had already been dropped, which dropped right in my command post amongst some of my men, who were burned terribly and began screaming and so forth. But I had to call off that second guy.
The colonel was really yelling, "Get that SOB off of us. Get him off. Call him off." And I looked up and I could see that can, just very slowly. Now there you go, slow motion, really. Everything kind of, the color drains out of everything too, because it's coming right at you.
We could see the silverfish, you know, flying in the air as if it were kind of glistening in the air and everything else. And we realized, hey, this has come short. And we stood up and we felt on our backs the heat and everything else. And then when we fell down and looked back, we could see several men wrapped up in fire in the napalm.
Felt a blast of heat from that, and a kid come running around there screaming that apparently hit, and his whole face was just like an ugly Halloween mask, you know.
Someone was yelling at me to get this man's feet. And I reached down and grabbed him by the ankles to lift him. And I could feel the bones in my hands. The flesh came off of his ankles. And I felt those bones. I still do.
And I hollered to Charlie Hastings, "Call that son of a bitch off." Yelled at him, screamed at him. And he called it off. And that guy pulled up and did not drop his cans with napalm.
Between friendly fire and the North Vietnamese attacks, the lost platoon is finally brought back into the battalion perimeter. It has eaten up resources and caused casualties, but the lost platoon kept the Americans on the offensive and possibly diverted the North Vietnamese from overrunning the landing zone. Ernie Savage knows they fought a lot of enemy.
I know we run head-on into a large unit coming down that valley. We would not have run head-on into them if we hadn't turned in and flanked and chased those people.
What had begun as a skirmish a day and a half earlier now settles into its second night at Landing Zone X-Ray. The 7th Cavalry has come to the Drang to engage the enemy on his turf, but has gotten more than it anticipated. As Hal Moore's troops in the 1st Battalion are worn down, the 2nd Battalion choppers in to help.
They were scared out there, and it was late and it was night, and they'd almost been overrun that evening.
A product of ROTC at Yale, Larry Gwynn is a scholarly soldier who studied the country and speaks Vietnamese.
There was a lot of noise, a lot of incoming, a lot of dead under ponchos, cartons and crates of ammunition scattered all over the place, and a lot of artillery and air. And I looked over and I could see a tall colonel. It was Hal Moore, and he had all his captains madly working on the radio. I'd never seen captains and colonels working so hard. It was a very scary situation because the rounds were coming in and we really didn't know what was going on.
Both sides used the second night at X-Ray to prepare for an all-or-nothing assault.
We were a thin line of well-dug-in troops with some booby traps out in front of us.
After a night of digging in and prayer, the battle resumes promptly on the 3rd morning at X-Ray.
We were attacked in the early morning, just before daylight, by 2 battalions of enemy.
At this stage of the game, it's almost trickish. There's really many soldiers running right across our guns. And I think B Company and my company are just basically mowing them down at that point of the game.
After that was it wound down, except that we were given a wake-up call with a short bomb came in on us and almost blew us to pieces. And we also engaged the enemy, what was left of them, the dead and the dying out there. Some of them wouldn't give up.
There were so many of this enemy coming at us. And there were so few of us. It was touch and go. It was a cliffhanger. It was like the last 15 seconds of a football game, tie ball game, that went on for 3 days and 2 nights. I lost 79 men killed, 121 wounded. I was grieved. We walked across the enemy bodies. We policed up over 400 weapons, and they abandoned the battlefield. You tell me who won that fight.
The 1st of the 7th flies home as the 2nd of the 7th mounts up and starts a 4-mile hike to a pickup point, a clearing called Landing Zone Albany. The plan is to keep their eyes open for enemy, then catch a helicopter home. But after 3 days and 2 nights of hell at Landing Zone X-Ray, what they don't know is that the worst of the Battle of the Drang Valley lies before them. After 3 tough days and a lot of blood, the battle for Landing Zone X-Ray in the Drang Valley is declared the first great victory for the American forces in Vietnam.
I characterize this entire campaign as being the most successful of this conflict thus far. I feel its success is really unprecedented.
The 1st Battalion of the 7th Cavalry is pulled out and heads home to base camp in An Khe to get some rest. At 9 a.m., Landing Zone X-Ray is vacated. On their way out, the Americans walk by the rotting corpses of North Vietnamese soldiers, some of whom have been lying there for 3 days. The 2nd Battalion of the 7th Cavalry had come into X-Ray as a reinforcement. Now exhausted and sleepless, and believing the Battle of the Drang to be over, it starts on the long, roundabout route to Landing Zone Albany, about 3 miles to the northwest.
We'd been awake for 2 solid nights on 100% alert. Had not slept well the night of the 14th. All our troops were almost comatose.
Captain George Forrest had starred as a running back from Morgan State. Now he commands a rifle company from the 1st Battalion of the 5th Cavalry that is tacked on to the end of the column bound for LZ Albany.
They're going to put in a B-52 strike on Chupong Mountain. And this was like 7 o'clock in the morning. I think the strike was going to come in at about 9. So that gave us 2 hours to get into the safe zone.
The air mobile troops are sent on foot, without air cover or artillery, or much basic security, on a march through hostile country.
We had to get out of there fast, and walking overland didn't seem to be as... we were infantry. I mean, it was nice to fly, but... and also walking in maybe gave us some opportunity to find something without making a lot of noise with helicopters.
Adding to the problem, the battalion commander is Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade. He's seen combat in Korea, but has most recently had a desk job at division headquarters. Apart from making sure the Americans are out of range for the B-52 strikes, there is no particular sense of purpose or urgency.
We took off walking, and the recon platoon was in the lead of the battalion. And it was fairly slow going. I mean, you don't move a big 300, 400, 500 men very fast. And we were, picking our way through.
We were told that this is going to be a piece of cake. We've already dealt them a pretty severe blow these 2 days, so you really don't have to do a whole lot.
After 3 hours on the trail, about 100 yards short of Landing Zone Albany, just before noon, Pat Payne's reconnaissance platoon takes a couple of prisoners.
And so we jumped on this North Vietnamese soldier. And he was a young kid, too, and he was shaking like a leaf. We scared the hell out of him. About that time, 10 yards away, my platoon sergeant jumped on another North Vietnamese. So we captured 2 of these North Vietnamese right there.
In blazing midday heat, the column stops dead in the tall elephant grass so the officers can ask the prisoners a few questions.
In retrospect, I wonder how we could have been so stupid as to not immediately assure ourselves that there were bad guys immediately to our front. But Colonel McDade interrogated them, and then we proceeded right into Albany. It gave the enemy half an hour to set up for us, before it know that we were coming.
The troops stay in place in the column while their commanders go forward to discuss tactics. The Americans have no idea they have wandered to within a few hundred yards of of a North Vietnamese battalion.
And the company commanders came forward with the first sergeants to get their directions from the colonel.
We go forward, we pass through at least one company, and these guys are sitting, smoking, joking, and I'm thinking, not a good idea. We get up to where the battalion headquarters is, and I hear what sounds like incoming mortar fire.
This is the part of the Drang where I can no longer play the detached narrator. It now becomes my story. I was a 20-year-old private and part of the column working its way to Landing Zone Albany that day. It's where I fought and almost died. In late 1993, I went back to Landing Zone Albany for an emotional reunion with some of the men I fought alongside and against. Together, we would relive a battle and its aftermath that changed our lives forever.
And then all of a sudden, everything started firing. Everything, just the whole thing just opened up. All the way through there, the column. There were NVA coming across from here. There were Vietnamese NVA coming across from there. There were NVA charging into the killing zone of the ambush.
Well, when the shooting started, when they triggered the ambush, the companies were leaderless. All leaderless. We were all down in the grass, and within 30 seconds to a minute, the North Vietnamese, who were only 50 feet from us, jumped up from their positions and ran at us with Tommy guns, with AKs blazing. And they were, in other words, within a few minutes of the ambush being sprung, they were mixed with our people. In other words, it was down to 3-4 men fighting 3-4 men. You had like an American machine gunner and a couple of other Americans there, and you'd have 6 North Vietnamese here and 6 here. Jump them, shoot them, bayonet them, kill them. Look for the next clump of Americans. It was the Little Bighorn all over again. It was a massacre.
What we weren't ready for is that all of a sudden, I mean, we just got attacked by hundreds, you know, maybe thousands of these North Vietnamese coming at us. And boy, they were coming at us fast. And it was a sudden, violent hit, I think. And none of us were really dug in at all. You know, it was every man for themselves.
George Forrest doesn't wait to be excused from the commander's conference at the head of the column. He turns with his 2 radio operators and starts to run back to his men.
It was instinct. I knew that I couldn't stay there. I had to get someplace where I could feel safe. And if I got back there, there was a chance that, you know, they were still there, the company was still there. And somehow we could get out of this hell. I could hear the rounds going off in the trees. Maybe they weren't shooting at me. And this is exactly like it was.
He has to cover about 150 yards of jungle. That's all to attack.
It seemed like a lifetime. And I could see the rounds hitting the trees. And I know the guys saw me. It was just my day. They weren't, either they weren't good marksmen or I was faster than the bullets, and I don't think the latter's true.
Both of George Forrest's radio operators are shot dead, but Forrest keeps running.
The desperation is what drove me. Fear didn't enter my mind. I didn't have flashes of, I got 2 little boys in Columbus, Georgia, who's not going to see their daddy. I knew that there were 126 guys back there laying on a trail, waiting for somebody to come back and say, guys, this is what we have to do in order for us to get out of this situation.
Most of the other troops are lost and leaderless. George Forrest is the only commander to make it back to his unit. And once back there, the news is all bad.
I had lost a platoon leader. My executive officer had been wounded. I had lost 2 platoon sergeants and had a good deal of guys wounded. It was in the initial firefight that 16 guys in my unit were killed. We could hear guys screaming, lots of noise, just the sounds of we're being overrun, those kinds of things.
Forrest gets what remains of his rifle company to form a circle at the end of the column, and they are able to defend themselves. But for many, it becomes a savage killing ground.
Just instantaneously, it was chaos. Rounds coming in, bark falling off the trees, people screaming. Mortar rounds started coming where our second platoon was. I mean, when you hear the whomp of incoming mortar rounds, it just scares the living Jesus out of you. And everywhere you looked, you could see guys in mustard-colored uniforms moving around the jungle. You knew right away that we had run into something incredibly heavy and incredibly big. And behind us, the whole column was shooting. There was a raging battle in back of us, where the North Vietnamese had wheeled and attacked the side of the flank of our column. I screamed, "Here they come," because nobody was really looking, and 4 or 5 of us jumped up and shot them all. Behind me, I heard somebody scream, "Withdraw!" Which I thought was sort of funny because there was no place to go.
This point in the Battle of the Drang is where my own personal nightmare begins. I have not yet been wounded, but I am about to come under friendly fire.
North Vietnamese guy lay on top of me, using me and the sergeant as a sandbag for his machine gun, and started to fire. Hot shell casings were falling on my back. The only reason I couldn't keep myself from shaking, I was so terrified. The only reason he didn't know I was alive was he was shaking as much as I was. He was scared too. You get scared in combat. My friends were firing rifle grenades at this group of North Vietnamese. Finally, they connected. One of them landed right here in the sergeant's armpit, blew his whole body away, and hit me, cracked my jaw. Another one hit me in the leg, but it killed the guy on top of me.
After 2 hours, our units are overrun by the North Vietnamese. What had begun as an ambush is now a full-fledged slaughter.
And I was bandaging up a friend of mine. This guy was shooting right over our heads, didn't even see us. There was about this much elephant grass between him and me. So my friend said, "It's hurting my ears, it's hurting my ears." I just wanted to be a fly on the wall. I didn't want to shoot anybody. And he says, "It's hurting my ears." But because it was my buddy Bailey, and he was bleeding and had been wounded, and it was hurting his ears, I took my gun, put it on full automatic, gauged where the man's head was, stuck my gun all the way through the elephant grass until it hit something soft, and I squeezed the trigger. Sergeant Menzies said there was an anthill, that anthill, and right behind it was a guy on a machine gun without a head.
By 3 p.m., reinforcements start out on foot from another landing zone, Columbus, 2 miles away. But there isn't enough time. The cavalry must look to the skies for help.
We were told to throw smoke, and we circled our perimeter with smoke grenades, markers, colors, yellow, purple, green, everything we could find. So the boys upstairs had a pretty good idea of at least where we were. They came in 10, 15 passes, dropping canisters of napalm into the jungle around our field. An incredible sight to see canisters of napalm hitting the treetops and jellied gasoline trickling down like stalactites, and to see 15 or 20 North Vietnamese soldiers jump up from underneath it and try to escape, and the jellied gas just dripped down on them and engulfed them all. I saw that several times, and it was just, it's a hell of a picture. But the A1Es saved us by bringing our position with napalm. So after our position was basically ringed, we knew that we were going to be okay. Nobody could come across that field without getting horribly burned.
The airstrikes stopped the North Vietnamese advance, but landing zone Albany is under fire. The air cavalry Hueys cannot land. Finally, at 6:45 p.m. Wednesday evening, the cavalry arrives at landing zone Albany. Their mission is simple and straightforward.
Well, I gathered them around and I talked to them and told them, you know, look, we can get through this, but we've got to go in hard, you know, go in firing and go in tough on this one, because this is the real McCoy.
The plan, get dropped down between the North Vietnamese and the Americans, then shoot at one while you run toward the other.
They flew in a huge formation, maybe 18, 20 ships. And just as they came close, oh, the jungle opened up, and all the bad guys had just been waiting for them to come in. And so it wasn't going to be quite that easy.
They told us, you know, when you get out, you know, fire to your left and run to the right. You know, well, anybody going in helicopters knows that you can be disoriented. Helicopters can be disoriented somewhat, you know, and we weren't quite sure which. We could have been running straight into the enemy.
I remember them all sort of flying in and shooting to the left and exiting to the right into our position. They all came in, they all shot left, they exited right, and they came into our perimeter, and it was reunion week.
As what would turn out to be one of the bloodiest days of the Vietnam War turns to night, wounded Americans try to avoid certain death in the tall grass. North Vietnamese execution squads move in to mop up the battlefield. By nightfall Wednesday, the 17th, the Battle of the Drang is 4 days old. U.S. commanders estimate they have killed 1,600 North Vietnamese. 200 young Americans are dead too, and the number rises as North Vietnamese hit teams start to move among the wounded at landing zone Albany, executing them. I am among those wounded. In fear, I will be next.
They tried to come in and kill us. They were walking around killing the wounded. They were going around shooting all the wounded. Bang, 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 bang. Ha, 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 bang, ha, ha, ha. No, no, don't shoot me. Bang. We found men in the morning who'd been tied up and shot. A couple of them had been tied to trees and shot. They systematically killed our wounded. The next day we shot their wounded too. We weren't very happy.
There would be a cry or a shout or a no or a please, followed by a single shot. And we had a pretty good idea of what was happening.
Bob Jeanette is a lieutenant from the Bronx who'd been married 5 days before he shipped out to Vietnam. He lies in a field, wounded, with his men.
We knew if they found us, we weren't ambulatory, we weren't going anywhere. We would stay right there forever.
George Forrest sends men out to where we're hiding, the remnants of my unit huddled under a tree. But they tell us they can't take us all, and Bob Jeanette and I are left behind with a promise that they'll come back for us.
I stood up and passed out. I couldn't go in. But I thanked you for the effort. I appreciated it.
Then we hear visitors in the tall grass.
I radioed, don't come back, because the Vietnamese were back in the area in platoon-sized force, walking through the area, and I didn't want the patrol running in, so I said, don't send anybody. And they said, we won't.
Jeanette was calling in artillery around our tree, and every time the North Vietnamese patrol got up to us and started to try to get us and shoot at us, Jeanette would call in artillery around the tree so close that the shrapnel would hit some of us in the tree and kill them. He did that 2 or 3 times during the night.
The North Vietnamese continue to wander the battlefield, confident they have killed most of us.
I think the North Vietnamese really believed that they'd wiped everybody out. You know, when they started coming back like that, until they met some resistance, they really felt that they were just a ambush mop-up outfit that had strafed everybody and just going in there to police the whole thing up.
In the morning light on day 5 at Albany, those of us who have survived can finally take a look at what happened.
During the morning, I stayed in the perimeter, basically in a state of shock and exhaustion, and listened to the radio as B Company troops went out and policed up our dead and wounded. And that's the worst day of my life. I can't even think about that day. There were so many dead, so many wounded. It was awful. It was awful. I went out in the afternoon, finally, to see where our people had been, and I saw them. And they were all dead, and they were all spread out, and they were all fucked up.
The reality of daylight far outstrips the worst fears from the night.
You could trace our column. It was like a long traffic accident of bodies, really. I mean, it was almost down the column. There wasn't a tremendous amount of deployment once the fighting had started. The bulk of the people still were in column. A lot of mortarmen, I remember, with the mortars still on their backs. Terrible thing to see. You know, it meant they didn't deploy, they didn't have their weapons out even. It happened that swiftly for them. It was all over, and they were just sitting there. Some people with cigarettes clenched in their hands, lying out there.
The North Vietnamese have moved out to sanctuaries in Cambodia where the American troops may not pursue them. We leave as soon as we are able, and landing zone Albany is abandoned. 155 young Americans die at Albany, one of the worst days of the war, and twice the number of dead at landing zone X-ray a few days before. In all, 234 American soldiers die in the Battle of the Drang, and another 250 Americans are wounded. American commanders see the Drang as the breakthrough victory they've been looking for. It seems to show how to win this strange war of no front lines. How? By attrition, by killing more of the enemy than they kill of us.
I don't like to even trade one American or one ARVN trooper on our side for 50 of the PAVN, but you've got to be very realistic. When you get in this type fighting, if you get anywhere near 7 to 10 to 1, that's a damn good exchange.
But it's taken as an article of faith that when an enemy loses that many, he'll soon give up.
The headquarters in Saigon looked at the so-called body count of enemy, how many enemy were killed by my battalion and by Colonel McDade's battalion, how many friendly were killed, and the ratio was about 12 or 14 enemy to 1 American. And they looked at that body count in Saigon and said, this is the way to fight this war. This body count is satisfactory.
General William Westmoreland, U.S. commander in Vietnam, comes by the 7th Cavalry base camp at An Khê and salutes the troops.
I want to congratulate you on your distinguished victory. You men of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, have distinguished yourselves.
He has Thanksgiving dinner with the men who fought victoriously at X-Ray. The 7th Cavalry gets a Presidential Unit citation. But for those who lived through the Drang campaign, the memories don't focus on marching bands and military honors.
Well, I tell you, it's about as close to putting it in words, it was like hell. It's about as close to being to hell as you can get and come out alive.
Many of our units out there, 2 or 3 men at a time, fought like hunting buddies, you know. They stood together and they survived. It was really an act of survival, I believe, Albany. It wasn't an act of enlightened American tactics.
Landing Zone Albany is still abandoned when we visit 28 years later, but the memories are as fresh as they were those terrible days in November of 1965.
The grass was completely covered with blood. It was slippery. You walked on the grass. You slipped like that because it was covered with blood. It was bloody. And it smelled of urine and feces and blood and gunpowder, and it was just horrible. It's the most awful thing I've ever seen in my life, and I'll never forget it. About 150 men died right in these woods right here. And a lot of them were my friends, real good friends. I'm so sad they're dead. I'm so sad they're dead.
If anybody thinks it's a good idea to go to war, they're crazy. And if anybody has never walked a battlefield with 200-300 torn, bloating American and North Vietnamese bodies, then they shouldn't feel qualified to talk about the glory of war, because there is none. War sucks.
The Battle of the Drang introduced us to a whole new vocabulary: body counts, kill ratios, and search and destroy missions. It was not a battle against guerrilla fighters, but against heavily armed North Vietnamese regular troops. A few months after the Drang, my father came to Vietnam on assignment for ABC News and to check on my recovery.
3 years ago, this son of mine began college, but after a year he decided he was at loose ends and didn't know what he wanted to do with life, so he quit and he joined the Army. His age now is, in the words of the Marine General Lewis Walt, 21 going on 50.
Did you get hit by it? Right, it was a mortar that landed right behind me, lifted me off the ground.
got me through the leg here and down in here.
But you got a total of 5 or 6 wounds out of that.
Oh, well, I got 2 big ones here, and then ones like that all over my legs. I still got about 15 pieces of shrapnel in my legs.
The official death toll of Americans at the Drang was 234, and it set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the deaths of tens of thousands more. In the weeks after the battle, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara went to Vietnam to assess the situation. On the flight home, he wrote a memo to President Johnson. There were 2 options, he said. Look for a compromise way out of the war, perhaps not on our own terms, or go for a massive buildup of troops and accept thousands more casualties. A year later, there were 400,000 troops in Vietnam in a war that would go on for almost 10 more years. I'm Jack Smith. Good night.